Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. With me here in the studio is Jeff Moon. He served as assistant U.S. trade representative for China during the Obama administration. Also joining us from Portland is Liang. She is associate professor of economics at Willamette University. And also with us here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He is senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Jeff, let's start right here in the studio. So we have this late-breaking development. Huawei granted a temporary U.S. general license, meaning that it can continue to operate and trade with U.S. companies. What do you make of it?
Well, when the Commerce Department announced that Huawei was added to what's called the entities list, that meant that almost immediately any firm that wanted to transfer technology to Huawei needed a license. So we saw announcements today from Google and other companies they were going to stop doing that. They didn't have a choice because they didn't have a license. So now they do have a license. And what this means is that the Commerce Department has looked at the circumstances as they are and has decided, it appears, to not interfere with Huawei's principal business with regard to mobile phones.
But you would think that the White House would take a look at all these considerations before announcing this trade ban.
Well, perhaps maybe this is also related to the trade dispute as well.
Right.
That these are measures that could be taken, but that don't have immediate impact. And this is a major turning point in American policy. China has used national security grounds to ban many U.S. tech companies, social media sites, media platforms, even Wikipedia. But the U.S. has never reciprocated. And from a trade perspective, this is perhaps the first time that the U.S. is really talking about doing that. So this could be part of the trade negotiation and additional leverage Trump is seeking.
One other quick question before I get to the other guest, Jeff, and that is, could the White House have also made this announcement today because they started receiving telephone calls from companies that supply Huawei with components?
I assume they did. I've represented a company before that's been affected by export controls. And export controls have very dramatic effects that are not totally foreseeable. So I'm sure that people were bringing to the White House's attention the impact that this would have on users all around the world. They knew it would have a great impact, but maybe not all the specifics. And so this is to accommodate them, and again, not to make any specific immediate change in what's supposed to happen, but within 90 days, there could be a change.
Okay, let's go to Qinduo Xu. He's in Beijing. Qinduo, when the trade ban was initially announced, chip makers like Intel and Qualcomm were told that they could no longer supply critical software and parts to Huawei. We now have the 90-day reprieve, but the basic ban still stays in place. What impact will this have on the company?
Well, I think the impact on its phones would be probably the most right now. For not the existing phone users, Huawei phone users, but the new phone for them to sell to the users like in the European market. If the customers, they will not be able to access, for example, the Google Play Store, YouTube, Chrome, Gmail, I think that would be a great hit to Huawei. But at the same time, you would wonder why the U.S. is cracking down on the Huawei phones. Its phone does not have a security threat or accused of a security threat to U.S. national security or to personal information. I know the U.S. is mostly concerned about the 5G service, 5G equipment produced by Huawei. That's mostly about cheap the producers, the supply to Huawei. Huawei has its own chip maker company, but still it needs a cooperation from other companies, for example, a company from Taiwan. So it's a critical juncture. We will see whether Huawei can survive, whether Huawei will continue with the phone business or continue with its 5G services over there.
Liang, Jeff Moon just brought up an interesting point, and that is, could the action taken by the United States be part of the wider trade war between China and the United States? I mean, is the United States here looking for some kind of leverage to in the conduct of those negotiations?
I would think so. I think it's pretty clear from the earlier trade negotiations and with the tension on ETZ, it's clear that I think Trump's administration is trying to add more leverage for the trade negotiations. So all these talks about, threat to national securities, I think it's really just a protest. And I think, they decided not to implement, this blacklist. So giving 90 days of delay, it makes a lot of sense. I think, for one, it's not going to be helpful for U.S. companies. Qualcomm apparently sells 67% of their sales to China and Hong Kong combined, and Broadcom 17% sales. So if these entities if these companies are not able to sell, their supplies to Huawei, their own business will be undermined. And also, these talks about this so-called national threat has been really kind of abused by the Trump administration. So I think a lot of European companies and Southeast Asian economies are not on board with this, which means, out of the 92 core suppliers of Huawei, many of them are in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan. I think, Huawei is able to find alternative supplies. Not to mention, since mid-2018, Huawei has been preparing for this. They have been reducing the reliance on the U.S. suppliers and try to buy more from Taiwanese suppliers, and also develop their own chips. They also started to develop their operating system since 2012. So I think Huawei is not unprepared for this. And if Trump did decide to go ahead with the blacklisting, it's not clear how much this is going to hurt Huawei and at what cost for the United States.
Oh, right, that's right. There are reports that Huawei has stockpiled chips, a 3-month supply of chips. Sourabh, what is your view on this latest action by the United States? And to Qinduo's point that if the United States is invoking national security interests in imposing this trade ban on Huawei, how did national security interests impact telephones?
Interesting point, but I would say that the national security argument has been intimately connected in the course of these trade negotiations with the telecoms issue. As she pointed out, last year at this very time we were talking about ZTE, and the trade negotiations went in a downward spiral exactly at this time about a year ago. When Donald Trump called President Xi Jinping on October 30th and began the process of trade discussions again, which have been ongoing for the most part very well until recently, that very day, the Commerce Department put a Chinese firm called Fujian Jinhua on the entities list, apparently because it was for theft of commercial espionage and theft of chip technology from an American company, Micron. As the trade negotiations went well, Fujian Jinhua was almost on the verge of having to stop production. But as the trade negotiations went well, there were suddenly reports that Fujian Jinhua would be rehabilitated, to the point in early May there was even a petition from Fujian Jinhua to be removed from the entities list. So this up and down has been absolutely parallel with the state of the trade negotiations. Now, we do have to understand, though, that with regard to Huawei, it's not just purely the technology competition issue, but it's also the Meng issue and the issue of secondary sanctions and Iran. So there are multiple aspects playing in out here. But the point being, at the end of the day, if US and China can reach a good trade, investment, and IPR agreement, we will also simultaneously see the US taking a much more liberal approach on technology sharing in core and foundational technologies, technology flows in core and foundational technologies between the US and China. And if the trade negotiations were to collapse, it would be vice versa.
Jeff, Huawei buys something like $67 billion worth of components from outside companies, including United States companies. That business will now be lost to US companies. So Qualcomm, at least Huawei, may be in a position to seek other markets, to seek other sources, but the US is going to lose that business.
Well, I'm not sure that the technology we're talking about is available from other sources. So there is the potential of that. For the next 90 days, that's not going to happen.
Right.
We'll see. I think, though, that the path forward on this is through the trade negotiations. We're currently in a pause. Both sides are sort of thinking about where we are. I think they both overestimate their strengths and underestimate their interdependence, and that over time, that facts are going to sift into the situation. We need to think about national security, and we need to narrowly tailor national security to address specific national security needs. And perhaps we'll come to some agreement on Huawei. Perhaps China needs to reconsider whether Wikipedia is a threat to its national security as well. And this is a discussion that's long overdue in terms of rectifying how we think about national security. You know, there's a great irony in here. One of the most damaging aspects of all this to Huawei is the loss of Google apps in third countries. These are all apps that are banned in China because they are a threat to Chinese national security. Maybe China ought to allow Google and its products into China, and that could help resolve this situation as well. So this is a very complicated thing that I think we need to rethink and need to work it out.
Right. Qinduo, if you listen to the comments coming from U.S. officials, if you listen to a lot of the commentators here in the United States, it would seem at this stage that the United States is holding all the cards in this dispute. But does China have any leverage of its own?
Well, you know, we hope the things will getting worse and worse. You know, there's a visit by President Xi Jinping to a rare earth elements production factory over in southwestern part of China. And also previously, there was talk of retaliatory measures using rare earth. You know, China is the chief exporter of rare earth, which is necessary for the making of like weapons and other chips, etc. But that would be a downward trend for the trade war to deepen between the two countries. You know, we don't like to see that. Hopefully, of course. The thing is, like, you know, for a lot of Chinese people here is, you know, Huawei. You know what, or what crime or what Huawei is guilty. You know, you have Madam Meng Wanzhou about related to the Iranian sanctions, possible violation, but we don't have a conclusion. And also the accusation of Huawei, you know, stealing technology from U.S. company, we don't have a conclusion either. And now it's about national security. I do have a similar concern with my colleagues, you know, like, are we abusing national security concern, you know, to intervene in the normal business operations? I agree. I think, you know, the two countries should sit down and talk about the national security, and including the apps, for example, for Google, etc. I think if the U.S. is concerned with that, they should talk to the Chinese side. But now, you know, the U.S. is trying basically to kill the most powerful, or the Chinese people, they feel the most proud, the company here. And it's like a wake-up call. U.S. is not reliable, and it's very difficult for them to cooperate with the U.S. side. But, you know, for the sake of the two economies, I would encourage them to continue the discussion sometime in the future.
So, Liang, we talk about the impact this will have on United States companies, on, of course, Huawei as well. But what kind of global impact would this have, especially in the countries of Europe and Asia as well?
Right. So if you look at the U.S. and China, both economies constitute about 40% of the global GDP. So if these two countries are hurt by this trade tension, then the whole world economy will be the collateral damage. And by some estimates, if the U.S. and China really go into this sort of all-out trade war, then this could shed China's GDP growth by 0.8 percentage points, and for the U.S. would be 0.3 percentage points, and for the global economy, that will be another 0.2 or 0.3 percentage points of GDP growth slowdown. I wanted to go back to the point that, again, this trade war and retaliation are going to produce only lose-lose situation. So does China have cards? Yes. The Chinese intellectuals have been talking about, you know, trade restrictions, talking about making the lives of the U.S. companies in China harder, talking about selling the U.S. treasuries, and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, some of these measures will hurt the United States, but we don't want to win the battle but lose the war. I feel like, you know, a lot of these measures are going to hurt China in its own turn. And I think what is important here is both countries are trying to have growth, to have technological leadership. So I think both countries should work on that, as opposed to trying to find ways to hurt each other, more and see who is going to blink first.
So what do you make of Yan Liang's observation there that what we're looking at right now is a lose-lose proposition?
Oh, I would absolutely say it's a lose-lose proposition. In terms of relative losses, yes, the Chinese side loses more than the American side, but one also has to remember, I mean, China today is at market rates, at market value, $10,000 per capita economy. In 25 years, that could be a $30,000 per capita economy. We're talking $20,000 per capita for 1.4 billion Chinese citizens. And is that a market you want to seed? China will obviously have difficulties coming in doing that innovation of core and foundational technologies on which many of their apps run. It'll be a longer process, but one needs to be a little scared, because if they do master that process, your market is gone forever. And there is a real danger on this Huawei case. You know, when the ZTE case broke last year, there was panic in China because there were a lot of jobs on the line. This year, with regard to ZTE, there's not been that sort of panic. It's been that quiet anger, and perhaps the possibility that because Huawei is that much more technologically advanced, that it can grind through this. And if it does grind through this, we're talking both a separation in terms of technology flows between the two countries, and an enormous market which could get ceded.
Jeff, does the U.S. run the risk of winning the battle and losing the war?
I think both countries, I agree with Yan Liang, both countries could lose the battle and both would lose the war. There's not going to be a winner here. This really is a lose-lose situation. That's why we need to get back to negotiations. The foreign minister talked with his counterpart Mike Pompeo over the weekend and said he wanted to negotiate on the basis of equality. And equality is what this negotiation is all about. China currently runs a $350 billion annual surplus with the United States. And we need to get back to an equal and mutually beneficial trading relationship. There are issues that are laid out there. We need to get to them and resolve them. If we do not resolve those issues in this negotiation, I fear we will move into a new stage, because the issues aren't going to go away, a new stage of reciprocity. And I see functionally this Huawei episode as reciprocity for all of the American firms that have been blocked out. This is from a trade perspective. And we will start seeing more and more Chinese firms getting the same treatment that American firms are receiving in China. And that's going to be very unhelpful for both. So let's negotiate it and go back. The problem is that there's a 150-page document that was out there. China says, we don't know what was agreed. Nothing was agreed. But there were 150 pages of something out there that we can get back to and talk about, and they need to be enforceable. Promises we've had before, we need something enforceable.
Qinduo, Jeff makes
go ahead.
Yeah,
can I add? Yeah, right. You know, in terms of the agreed so-called, the tax agreed upon by the two sides. The Chinese side would say it's not a done deal yet, and that there are back and forth. That's a natural part of negotiation. I think, according to the information available right now, is mostly about some of the clauses. It's really concerning the sovereignty issue. For example, people would say that would amount to the U.S. side dictating the Chinese industrial policy, the Chinese economic policy, and even lawmaking in some of the sectors. I think the Chinese leadership, it's very difficult to accept. I think there's a limit how far you can go. Obviously, the Chinese side is ready to make some concessions in terms of helping balancing the trade between the two sides and opening the market further, etc. There's no problem about that. But when issue related to sovereignty, I think the U.S. side should be more sensitive to that. But also, I want to add to that is really the atmosphere, I think, is pointing the relationship between the two sides. For the Chinese side, is still ready for more talks and to reach a deal in terms of trade. But obviously, we are seeing is that the U.S. is moving the war, if we can use the word, from trade to technology. And also there's a geopolitical consideration. There is a China hawks in Washington, D.C., basically everywhere in the administration and in the Congress. And people see China as an existential threat to the United States or challenger to the U.S. primacy. U.S. wants to remain the dominating power in the world in the new global system. And China is a challenger, so they are dealing with China. So that's more complicated than trade.
All right, Yan Liang, you know, we hear of all kinds of scenarios being talked about right now. One of the words we hear very often these days is so-called decoupling, decoupling these two major economies. These are two of the biggest economies in the world, the most important trade relationship in the world. What does decoupling mean, and is that what you think the U.S. wants ultimately?
I don't think so. I think it's clear that the U.S. and China's economies are complementary, and in many ways they are really highly interdependent. And this is not something that you can remove easily. And I don't think this is beneficial either. We're talking about global division of labor. We're talking about global value chain. We're talking about global cooperation in many of the big scale technological innovations and other challenges to humankind. So I don't think decoupling is desirable or realistic for that matter. But going back to the trade negotiations, I think it's from Liu He's recent TV interviews, it's clear that the sticking point here is that U.S. is not going to consider removing the tariffs and use it as a leverage to enforce the trade deals.
Right.
But to China, this is not fair. This is not equitable. This is not going to produce a win-win situation, but it's more punitive, and it challenges China's national dignity. So I think, after Trump gives 144 items for China to make concessions on, the U.S. should consider what they need to do in return.
Right, Sourabh, very quickly, I've got 40 seconds. Is this about trade, or is it, as a Financial Times commentator put it, part of a struggle for global preeminence?
I would say at this point it is about trade, and we shouldn't go that far. Maybe down the line it might turn out to be about that. It will be about technology competition and technology supremacy, but it is about the trade negotiations. And frankly, I would even say this is about the end game in the trade negotiations. Each side is brandishing and showing what it could do to hurt the other side. And perhaps at the end of the end game, we might have something really good to show for both sides.
So we could see this dispute with Huawei be resolved as part of a bigger trade settlement?
Yes, but I would say because Huawei is a slightly different company with that 5G leadership potential, the US has gone so strongly against 5G.
Okay.
Huawei will be under the scanner, but the rest of the trade brief can be settled amicably.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there, but before we close out the show, we have some exciting news to announce. This week, The Heat launches its own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. The podcast will cover similar global stories that we do now here on the show, but we will get a little bit more personal and candid with our guests and in-house correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just after a run, please give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search CGTN and you'll see The Heat podcast. Thanks for watching.